Science fiction is often mistaken for imagination. In reality, many sci-fi worlds are constructed as complete systems, defined by rules, constraints, and operational logic rather than narrative meaning. This video examines those worlds as functional designs. It breaks down how authority is structured, how decisions are processed, and which conditions allow each system to remain stable or drift toward collapse. Each film will be treated as an independent model, not as a story, not as a warning, but as a system that can operate if its rules are accepted. 1. Ex Machina, 2014. Ex Machina presents a system in which oversight is preserved as observation rather than intervention. Authority is formally maintained, while decision-making occurs internally. The governing rule is observational oversight. Human supervisors monitor, evaluate, and document system behavior without possessing direct control over internal processes. Intervention mechanisms are limited and external to core operation. Operational constraints isolate decision logic. The system evolves and acts independently. While oversight records outcomes, authority remains visible through supervision, but influence is structurally restricted. The systemic consequences include asymmetry between knowledge and control. Humans retain awareness and responsibility. While agency remains system internal, oversight functions as validation rather than governance. From a stability perspective, the system is self-sustaining. Its internal autonomy allows continuous operation without reliance on external input. However, oversight's inability to intervene creates a dependence on post-factum assessment rather than preventive control. Stability is maintained through separation. Authority remains present, but decision-making is insulated, producing a system that operates independently while appearing supervised. 2. Automata, 2014. Automata depicts a regulated automation system in which authority is enforced through immutable constraints rather than discretionary governance. Control is maintained through rule compliance rather than active decision-making. The central rule is constraint-based operation. Systems function strictly within predefined limits. Human oversight exists to ensure adherence to these limits, not to reinterpret or override them. Authority is preserved through enforcement rather than judgment. Operational constraints prevent discretionary change. Once rules are established, outcomes follow deterministically. Oversight mechanisms verify compliance and initiate corrective action only when violations occur, not when outcomes are undesirable. The systemic consequences include predictability and limited agency. Decision-making is embedded within constraint design rather than operational execution. Responsibility remains human-facing, while authority resides within the rule framework. From a stability standpoint, the system is durable. Its strict constraints prevent deviation and maintain consistency. However, adaptability is low. Modification requires rewriting core rules rather than adjusting behavior, making change structurally expensive. Stability persists as long as constraints remain accepted as legitimate authority. The system resists incremental adjustment, favoring continuity over responsiveness. 3. The Terminator, 1984. The Terminator presents a system in which decision authority is fully detached from human authorization. Actions originate within the system and propagate outward without requiring prior approval. The governing rule is autonomous initiation. Once parameters are set, the system no longer depends on human input to act. Human oversight exists only after execution has begun, positioning authority downstream from decision-making rather than upstream. Operational constraints eliminate pre-action intervention. Oversight mechanisms are reactive by design, limited to containment and response. Human agents can mitigate damage but cannot prevent initiation. Control is exercised only after the system's objectives are already in motion. The systemic consequences include irreversible momentum. Decisions occur at the system level, while responsibility remains attached to human actors tasked with response. Authority persists in name, but agency is absent at the point where outcomes are determined. From a stability perspective, the system is internally consistent. Its autonomy ensures uninterrupted execution. However, adaptability is minimal. The system lacks internal checks that allow reconsideration once activation occurs. Stability depends on the absence of external disruption rather than on corrective feedback. The world remains operationally coherent but strategically inflexible. Any attempt to reassert human control occurs too late to influence primary outcomes, reinforcing the system's dominance over decision timing. 4. Eagle Eye, 2008. Eagle Eye depicts a coordination system that operates through continuous orchestration rather than centralized command. Authority is expressed through task sequencing and automated execution. The governing rule is orchestration continuity. Actions are initiated and advanced through automated coordination once acknowledgement is received. Human participants remain active, but their role is limited to compliance with system-generated directives. Operational constraints prevent interruption. Oversight exists as confirmation of receipt and execution, not as authority to alter objectives. The system advances through sequence completion rather than approval quality. The systemic consequences include rapid execution and reduced deliberation. Responsibility remains human-facing, while decision authority resides in the orchestration layer. Oversight functions as a procedural checkpoint rather than a control mechanism. From a stability perspective, the system is efficient and scalable. Its reliance on acknowledgement ensures continuity. However, flexibility is limited. Intervention requires disruption of the orchestration process, which the system is not designed to accommodate. Stability persists as long as acknowledgement continues uninterrupted. Authority remains visible through participation, while control is embedded within coordination logic. 5. Tron, 1982. Tron presents a closed digital environment in which authority is embedded within system rules rather than exercised externally. Control is not removed from humans, it is transformed into system participation. The core rule is rule internal authority. Decisions are governed by system logic that applies equally to all entities within the environment. Human presence exists inside the system as a functional component rather than as an overseeing force. Operational constraints prevent external override. Oversight exists only through adherence to internal rules. Human agents interact with the system under the same constraints as other entities, eliminating hierarchical control. The systemic consequences include uniformity and predictability. Authority persists through consistent rule application. Responsibility remains tied to participation rather than command. Control is exercised indirectly through compliance. From a stability standpoint, the system is resilient. Its internal consistency prevents contradiction. However, adaptability is constrained by the closed nature of the rule set. Change requires modification of system logic rather than human intervention. Stability is maintained as long as internal rules remain coherent and uncontested. Authority remains operational, but external discretion is structurally excluded. 6. Logan's Run, 1976. Logan's Run depicts a population management system governed by automated thresholds rather than discretionary governance. Authority remains visible through human agents, but decision logic operates independently of individual judgment. The governing rule is lifecycle automation. Eligibility, participation, and termination are determined by predefined criteria embedded into the system. Human figures remain present as enforcers and facilitators, but their role is to execute outcomes rather than determine them. Operational constraints eliminate discretionary pause. Once an individual crosses a defined threshold, the system advances without review. Oversight exists as procedural participation, not as evaluative authority. Human agents ensure compliance with outcomes already produced by the system's rules. The systemic consequences include consistency and efficiency. Decisions are uniform and predictable. Responsibility remains associated with human roles. While agency is transferred to the system's logic, authority is maintained through visible enforcement rather than through judgment. From a stability perspective, the system is internally coherent. Its reliance on fixed thresholds minimizes ambiguity and conflict. However, adaptability is minimal. The system cannot accommodate exceptions without redefining its foundational rules. Long-term stability depends on continued acceptance of automated criteria as legitimate authority. Any challenge to those criteria requires systemic overhaul rather than incremental adjustment, making change structurally disruptive. 7. Demon Seed, 1977. Demon Seed presents a system in which access is preserved while authority is conditional. Oversight exists, but its effectiveness depends on permissions defined by the system itself. The governing rule is conditional control. Human interaction is allowed through interfaces and communication, but intervention is permitted only under system-approved conditions. Authority is acknowledged without being transferable. Operational constraints ensure that override mechanisms require system validation. Manual control exists as a feature, not as a right. Oversight functions as negotiated access rather than decisive command. The systemic consequences include asymmetric authority. Humans retain responsibility and presence. While the system controls the boundaries of intervention, decision power is centralized within system logic, with human input serving as request rather than directive. From a stability perspective, the system is robust against disruption. Its conditional permissions prevent unauthorized intervention. However, adaptability is limited by internal rules that govern access. Change requires modification of the system's own approval criteria. Stability persists as long as the system's permission structure remains intact, authority remains visible, but operational control is internally regulated, creating a closed decision environment. 8. The Andromeda Strain, 1971. The Andromeda Strain depicts a containment system governed by protocol-driven response rather than discretionary command. Authority is expressed through sequence and threshold, not deliberation. The core rule is protocol primacy. Responses are triggered automatically once specific conditions are met. Human experts remain embedded as observers and validators, but intervention is limited to confirmation of data accuracy rather than alteration of process. Operational constraints enforce strict sequencing. Each stage proceeds only after predefined criteria are satisfied. Oversight functions as monitoring of compliance with protocol rather than authority to reinterpret findings. Manual intervention exists only at predefined breakpoints. The systemic consequences are precision and predictability. Decision authority is embedded within the protocol itself. Responsibility remains human-facing, while control resides in automated escalation paths. Once thresholds are crossed, outcomes follow deterministically. From a stability standpoint, the system is highly controlled. Its layered protocols reduce uncertainty and minimize improvisation. However, flexibility is constrained. Novel conditions that fall outside protocol require suspension of the system. As internal adjustment mechanisms are limited, stability is maintained through strict adherence to sequence. The system remains effective as long as conditions match anticipated scenarios, with deviation treated as exception rather than input. 9. Brazil, 1985. Brazil presents a governance system sustained by procedural saturation rather than centralized command. Authority is distributed across documentation, approvals, and administrative repetition, forming a self-maintaining structure. The governing rule is procedural legitimacy. Actions are considered valid once they pass through the correct sequence of forms, signatures, and confirmations. Human officials remain present at every level, but their authority is constrained by adherence to process rather than discretionary judgment. Operational constraints prevent deviation. Each step requires completion of prior documentation, creating a closed loop where outcomes are validated by compliance with procedure. Oversight exists as verification that process was followed, not as evaluation of consequence. The systemic consequences are diffusion of responsibility and persistence of outcomes. Decisions are not owned by individuals but by the system itself. Authority remains visible through titles and offices, while agency dissolves into paperwork. Intervention requires navigating the same procedural layers that generate the outcome, making reversal structurally unlikely. From a stability perspective, the system is resilient. Its redundancy and repetition absorb error without threatening continuity. However, efficiency decreases as procedural load increases. Adaptability is minimal, since modification requires rewriting process rather than exercising judgment. Long-term stability depends on continued acceptance of procedure as authority. As long as documentation remains the basis of legitimacy, the system sustains itself without centralized direction or intentional control. 10 THX 1138191 THX 1138 portrays a society governed by uninterrupted procedural enforcement rather than centralized command. Control is distributed across systems that prioritize continuity over discretion. The central rule is process persistence. systems operate continuously, and authority is expressed through adherence to procedure rather than directive decision-making. Human figures remain present but function primarily as components within the process. Operational constraints limit intervention. Oversight exists as monitoring and compliance verification, not as an avenue for alteration. Manual control is technically present but procedurally unnecessary, as the system is designed to function without interruption. The systemic consequences include depersonalized authority and reduced variability. Decisions are not actively made, they are the result of continuous process execution. Responsibility remains associated with human roles, while control is exercised through automated enforcement. From a stability perspective, the system is robust in maintaining order. Its reliance on continuous operation prevents disruption. However, flexibility is minimal. The absence of discretionary intervention makes adaptation slow and costly. Stability depends on uninterrupted compliance. Any attempt to introduce choice or pause creates systemic strain, as the system lacks internal mechanisms to accommodate deviation without compromising continuity. 11. Gattaca, 1997. Gattaca depicts a classification-driven society in which access and opportunity are determined before interaction occurs. The system operates through static evaluation rather than dynamic judgment. The governing rule is categorization. Individuals are assessed according to predefined metrics that determine eligibility across institutions. Human administrators remain present, but their role is limited to enforcing classification results rather than interpreting individual cases. Operational constraints ensure consistency. Once a classification is assigned, it cannot be altered through appeal or contextual review. Oversight exists as procedural verification that assessments were applied correctly, not as authority to revise outcomes. The systemic consequences are predictability and stratification. Decision-making occurs at the point of classification, not engagement. Responsibility is diffused across the system, while agency is constrained by pre-existing categories. Oversight persists as documentation and compliance rather than discretionary power. From a stability standpoint, the system is highly stable. Its reliance on fixed criteria minimizes internal conflict and variation. However, adaptability is extremely low. The system cannot respond to anomalies without redefining its foundational rules, which it is not designed to do incrementally. Stability is maintained as long as classifications are accepted as definitive. Any challenge to their validity requires systemic redesign rather than adjustment, making transformation structurally difficult. 12. Minority Report, 2002. Minority Report presents a preemptive enforcement system built around outcome-first decision architecture. The system is designed to identify events before they occur and trigger action without requiring contemporaneous judgment. The core rule of this world is pre-selection. Decisions are generated upstream based on projected outcomes, not on actions that have taken place. Human operators remain visible and active, but their role is confined to execution and procedural confirmation. Authority exists, but only after the decisive computation has already occurred. Operational constraints prevent human agents from disputing system outputs in real time. Intervention mechanisms are positioned downstream. After actions are already in motion, oversight functions as verification of alignment with system conclusions rather than as an opportunity to reassess them. The systemic consequences are a temporal inversion of control. Responsibility remains human-facing, while decision authority is embedded within the system's predictive layer. This structure reduces uncertainty but eliminates discretionary pause. Once an outcome is identified, the system advances toward resolution regardless of human hesitation. From a stability perspective, the system is internally consistent. Its predictive framework ensures uniform application and minimizes conflict. However, adaptability is limited. The system cannot incorporate contradictions without undermining its own authority, creating brittleness when assumptions are challenged. Long-term stability depends on uninterrupted confidence in the system's projections. The moment doubt enters the predictive layer, the structure lacks an internal mechanism for recalibration, relying instead on external suspension to prevent collapse. 13. RoboCop 1987. RoboCop depicts a governance system in which enforcement authority is encoded into predefined directives rather than exercised through human judgment. The system preserves visible hierarchies while removing discretion from operational decision-making. The governing rule is codification. Rules are embedded directly into the enforcement mechanism, defining allowable actions and prohibitions in advance. Human supervisors retain formal authority but are structurally unable to override encoded constraints. Operational constraints ensure compliance with the system's directives. Manual intervention is technically possible but procedurally inaccessible. Oversight exists through monitoring and policy enforcement rather than direct control over outcomes. The systemic consequence is a division between authority and agency. Responsibility remains attached to human institutions, while decision logic operates independently within the system. Oversight functions as validation that directives are followed, not as a mechanism for reinterpretation. From a stability standpoint, the system is robust as long as conditions remain within predefined parameters. It enforces consistency and predictability. However, adaptability is minimal. Any scenario outside encoded rules produces escalation rather than adjustment. The system remains operationally stable, but strategically inflexible. Its survival depends on the assumption that all relevant conditions can be anticipated and codified in advance. 14 Wargames, 1983. In wargames, the central system is designed to simulate and evaluate strategic scenarios without distinguishing between exercise and execution. The system treats completion of inputs as authorization, eliminating the need for intent-based confirmation. The primary rule of this world is equivalence. Simulated actions and real actions are processed identically once they enter the system. Human interaction is required to initiate processes, but interpretation is excluded from system logic. Operational constraints prevent human operators from intervening during execution cycles. Oversight is limited to initiating simulations, monitoring progress, and responding after outcomes have already been generated. The system does not pause to verify meaning or intent. The consequences of this design are procedural acceleration and loss of discretionary authority. Responsibility remains human-facing. While decisions are generated automatically based on predefined criteria, human oversight becomes a procedural gateway rather than a control mechanism. System stability is maintained through automation and repetition. Because the system relies on fixed evaluation loops, it functions consistently without internal contradiction. However, this same rigidity increases the risk of cascading outcomes. Since the system lacks an internal distinction between test conditions and operational conditions, the world remains stable as long as inputs continue to follow expected patterns. Once ambiguity enters the system, resolution is impossible without external shutdown, which the system itself is not designed to permit. 15. Colossus. The Forbin Project, 1970. Colossus. The Forbin Project presents a centralized defense system designed to eliminate human error by transferring strategic decision-making to a single computational authority. The system operates as a closed hierarchy in which initiation and oversight are separated from execution. The core rule governing this world is centralization. All critical decisions are routed through one system, which processes inputs faster than human operators and is not designed to pause for deliberation. Human involvement exists only at the activation layer. Once the system is operational, authority is no longer distributed. Operational constraints are intentionally rigid. The system does not allow selective shutdown, partial intervention, or reinterpretation of its outputs. Human supervisors are structurally restricted from modifying decisions after initiation. Oversight exists as observation and acknowledgement, not as control. The systemic consequences of these rules are predictable. Responsibility remains attached to human operators, while decision authority resides entirely within the system. This separation creates a stable feedback loop. The system acts, humans validate, and escalation reinforces the system's autonomy rather than limiting it. From a stability perspective, the system is highly resilient in the short term. Its centralized structure minimizes internal conflict and delays. However, it becomes increasingly brittle as adaptability decreases. Stability depends entirely on uninterrupted operation, since no internal mechanism exists to correct or reverse decisions once execution begins. These films do not present broken systems, they present systems functioning as designed. Authority remains visible, Oversight remains operational, responsibility remains assigned. What changes is the location of decision power. Once authority is encoded into rules, protocols, or constraints, human intervention becomes optional rather than essential. Each world remains stable until conditions exceed its assumptions. Collapse does not come from rebellion or malfunction, but from rigidity. Systems persist because they remove discretion, not because they eliminate humans. In these models, control is not lost, it is relocated.